Hi everyone, this is Mike, and this is my capstone project on rural poverty for the course. Throughout the deck, I will go through different factors as applied to rural poverty that I attempted to look at through different research and books. I'll cover some data trends and studies that I found as part of that research, and also try to apply it to structural functionalism and some of the concepts that revolve around that paradigm, specific to cultural transmission and social stratification. My interest in this topic also goes back a couple of years where I've had the opportunity to do some studies in past coursework, but never had a chance to look at sociology aspects of it or behavioral aspects of it that would explain the behavior. So I found this to be a great opportunity to go back on some of that past coursework that I've done and really found it eye-opening in many ways. I also had a higher level of interest too is, one of my topics that I always like are documentaries revolving around American life and current news and current situations. And I've always looked back on a documentary over the recent years called Rich Hill. And that was a documentary, I think in 2014, based on the lives of three teenagers growing up in rural poverty in a small town in Missouri. And it always stuck with me in that documentary. These teenagers and these children were so resilient, facing what they come across in poverty, but yet they're surrounded by grown-ups that are rooted in self-defeatism and really carry that through their lives, and it perpetuates itself onto the next generation. So I found that as one aspect that I tried to look at also as I went through this. And I also wanted to leave it also as part of the one book that I read last year, not related to this topic, but very pertinent, was Hillbilly Elegy. And that was the book by J.D. Vance, a bestseller that covered his journey through poverty and his extended family in Appalachia. And it was an eye-opening book that went into the deeper cultural roots and historical roots of the behaviors of cultural poverty as applied to rural America, in that time frame. And he also had a great quote in there about learned helplessness, as far as a person who believes that in his youth they had choices, but those choices had no effect on the outcomes in their life. And that really plays into the, as people grow up in these situations and get older, that plays into the self-defeatism and becomes more deeper rooted as part of the problem going forward. So this is the rest of my presentation. I hope you enjoy it. Thank you. I just wanted to spend a couple of minutes on some data points that I found from the USDA.gov website. This was a really good detailed study that I found linked through the census data and census statistics that were used for these studies. And I had a couple of key takeaways when I looked at that study that really opened my eyes on a couple of things that you don't think about just beyond the financial impacts of poverty. If I look at the growing gap or the gap or the trend over the last several decades between what we call non-metro or rural versus metro poverty levels, you do see it follows the same trend as the economic cycles that we've seen, but you also see no change in the gap between non-metro and metro area poverty levels. And another thing that stood out to me too as I was going through the study is things that don't get factored in that you have to consider as part of poverty are things like lack of access to education or lack of access to good healthcare systems that would be more prominent or more likely to have access in metro areas that you probably wouldn't see in non-metro areas. So so besides the financial parts of poverty, the financial aspects, there's a whole other part of that doesn't go into, the overall, measurement of poverty as you look at things at a holistic level, and how that also contributes to, the levels of despair that people may feel. And I also dug a little bit deeper into too, where I was looking at what they were called persistent poverty. Persistent poverty is defined as areas that had 30 years or more of a historical poverty levels with no improvement or trends in the poverty level in those counties or areas. And you can see where these areas are concentrated. And no surprise based on things that I've seen in the past or might have looked at before. But obviously a higher concentration in the South, Midwest, Appalachia, and also out in the Indian reservations of the Southwest or Dakota areas, and also in Alaska. As part of the presentation, I also wanted to take a closer look at different aspects of rural poverty and trying to get just away from a general perspective. I looked at 2 different books as part of the research that gave me different portraits of rural poverty and poverty in general, and it actually was pretty eye-opening in many ways for me. The first one was The Missing Class by Catherine Newman and Victor Chan, and this was, I call it, a diverse portrait of different families living in poverty. The key themes focused on the values and behaviors of these families as they try to fight their way out of poverty and the challenges they face. I thought it was a good example of an ethnographic study, an observation over time as he profiled 9 different families over this time period. It didn't provide a lot of hard data, but it gave me a great insight on the inner workings of the family unit living in poverty itself. The second book, though, was more of a deeper dive, specifically into white-collar poverty, Coming Apart. This was by Charles Murray. This was specifically a study on white working-class America over the last 50 years and trends associated with poverty. And what I found interesting with this book and research was he looked at key themes they called founding virtues, which were virtues from the 19th century, core aspects of different value systems, and it was so focused on industriousness, honesty, marriage, and religiousness applied to the white working class, poor, and upper middle class populations. And he really took those virtues and applied it to 2 different settings. One setting would be like a white lower class poverty center, and then one against an upper middle class population. And he really found over time this dividing gap that increased in the lower class poverty center, and this rapid decline in the virtues, he said, across the working class was really a tipping point, as far as where you see this trend starting over 30 years ago and then increasing today, specifically with white men, in poverty, which seem to be less active in the community and also less inclined to seek opportunities. The so-called self-defeatism as part of the culture, or part of what is also rooted in some of the other studies and the other books that I've come across. And I also found that kind of stuck with me through some of the other studies. So this was really my closer look in general at aspects of rural poverty and trying to apply it to something more specific within our sociology paradigms. I looked at structural functionalism as the paradigm to apply towards rural poverty in general. One thing we learned in the course, the core foundational concepts of structural functionalism are based on cultural transmission and innovation through education for growth in society. And one thing to keep in mind, areas that are persistent in high poverty tend to be agricultural based, lower skilled wages or lower skilled jobs. But applied to the concepts, also serve important functions. Everything has a function within structural functionalism. Everything has a purpose, and obviously it's an important function, because agriculture provides food and provides a very important part of our economy, an important part of our society in general. But at the same time, it also creates the social stratification that exists today and contributes to the gap that I showed on the prior chart, where you don't see the lessening of that gap, where it stays constant. And this trend, I think, also originates with migration towards urban areas in the north that probably started in the mid-20th century as people migrated towards more higher wage factory jobs, automotive industry or other industries. Some of these jobs evolved into higher skilled service jobs, further creating the gap and leaving the people in the agricultural areas or the rural areas a little further behind. And again, as part of the structural functionalism paradigm, stratification in general exists to provide important functions for society overall. Higher skilled jobs will command higher pay based on merit per the paradigm, but it also ignores the lack of equal opportunity and life chances that would come for somebody that might have the skill or the ability, but might not necessarily have that opportunity. And one analogy I've always saw or read that was constant was the analogy of the brain surgeon who, a brain surgeon is very highly skilled, and a brain surgeon takes years of education and training and probably a lot of money to pay for that education up front. But it shouldn't ignore also the fact that there's people at all levels, not just at a general meritocracy, but people in general at different levels of economic backgrounds that might have that skill or lack that opportunity. Brain surgeon is just one example, but that can apply to anything across the board. It's just the ability to create policies and have things in place for society in general to offer up these opportunities and make it a true meritocracy, not just one that's based on people that have the access or the ability to pursue those opportunities. In general, this is my conclusion throughout the study, and I could have spent more time, given the length of the presentation. There's obviously so many different areas I could have gone into and looked into. So this is more of an extended study or paper, but I just want to leave it on a couple of key thoughts that I picked up from my research or the topics that I looked at here. One, rural poverty is a diverse issue. It's not just associated with white poverty. I think that's a misconception when you hear rural poverty, and people might tend to think of Appalachia or different areas of the country that would typify rural poverty, where in many ways rural poverty is across a wide spectrum of racial divides, and it has many different aspects within that contribute to the poverty itself. I tried to examine closer themes through the different books I looked at. Diverse families that are working hard to escape poverty as a counterpoint also to white working class poverty that can have a higher element of self-defeated behavior and factors that might contribute to that. I also attempted to look at the elements of structural functionalism as that one paradigm applied to social stratification, and how it doesn't necessarily lessen the gap unless there's equal opportunity for merit-based advancement across all economic backgrounds. Access and affordability of higher education is an example I could think of that comes to mind that runs counter to the whole narrative of structural functionalism. And lastly, it's a complex problem. Obviously, it's very complex and requires solutions at the macro level on many fronts, through policy, infrastructure, healthcare, and education reforms. So that's my conclusion. That's my research paper capstone project for the course. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.